Okay, hi Kate, welcome to the second round of our videos. How has your week been, Kate?
Yeah, hi Rin, it's great to be back with you, albeit remotely again. And yeah, it's been an interesting week. For us, it's the first week back at school. My children are 8 and 15, so they're at quite different stages developmentally and educationally, and also just in life in general. I guess I've been very aware that aside from their sort of specific concerns, whether that's exams or, major stresses like you've forgotten how to tie your shoelaces, you can guess which child that relates to.
Clearly the oldest.
Absolutely, yeah. I think there's just been a general rise in their tension levels. I think I've been aware that it is an adjustment. It's not specifically that they've been dealing with anything negative. It's just yet another change, isn't it, that they've had to adjust to. So for all of us, I've seen that slight change, and that's been a good reminder that, just as we talked about last week, going back to normal doesn't make the change any less stress provoking, and particularly for younger children who don't have that concrete sense of normal and who will have adjusted more completely to this new normal. Going back to the way that things were is a significant adjustment. And I guess for me, as mum in the household, I've been interested in my own reactions, and it's reminded me that sometimes they can take us by surprise. Our emotions are our brain's way of grabbing our attention and analytical resources to make sure that we process something, that we understand something. And sometimes the way that emotions hit, therefore, can be a bit unexpected. For me, homeschooling was a bit of a nightmare, the extra demand, because my work is quite demanding, and trying to balance that with teaching and cooking and looking after everyone was really difficult. I thought I would be really relieved last week, but actually I did find I had some moments of poignancy, deleting my son's regular Zoom meet with his teachers from my diary, or just making lunch for one person suddenly. So I guess, it's just made me reflect again on the complexity of this whole season, and how we have to be very accepting of whatever it is that we're each one in our household feeling, whatever that is. And sometimes that might not be the things that we expect.
No. And I mean, we're going to specifically talk about anxiety this second video. And I mean, anxiety is so much now in the forefront of a lot of our minds, children's, parents. And I've had a child say to me, I'm suffering from anxiety. They were just concerned over a small thing that we talked about, and they managed it. Why do you think that this is happening? Why is anxiety such a forefront, and especially with the return into school?
Yeah, and I think it's really good right at the beginning of the conversation to pick up that very important point about anxiety, because it's not in essence an illness.
No.
But we've become so used to hearing about it in those terms that for many people that has become what they automatically think of when they hear the word anxiety, and particularly for children and teenagers, young people who've grown up with that concept. Anxiety is a normal, healthy human emotion, and in fact, it's essential for your mind to work well. It has a vital role, and I always say it's a bit like a smoke alarm. It's your brain's way of grabbing your attention and focusing it on something going on in your surroundings that might be important, that might be significant. It might need you to do something, to act or react or change something. So it's very, very physically expressed. It's a very physically experienced emotion, because it harnesses what you've probably heard of, or people watching will have heard of, called the fight or flight response, which is the same physiological system as your stress system, which we talked about a bit last week. And so anxiety triggers that really specific combination of like physiological change, but also physical sensation that we so recognize. And it's so difficult to ignore deliberately, because its job is to get your attention. So that churning sensation in your stomach, feeling fidgety, all those things, we don't like to feel anxiety. And I guess that physical change is there to grab our attention, but it's also part of setting you up in case you do need to act or react, the classic fight or run away. But because we don't like it, that does mean that we slot quite easily into this story of narrative as illness, narrative as something we don't want, but you'll never actually eradicate it from your life. Anxiety is a sign that that something matters to you, it's important. And it's also very associated with uncertainty. And so much of life, not just the bad stuff like pandemic, but good things, going for a job that you really hope you'll get, taking an exam, even things like first dates or getting married, those moments will also be tinged with anxiety. And often when anxiety starts to get bigger and more problematic, it's linked to a kind of worst case scenario. It's something that we're afraid might happen, or your brain is warning you could be a possibility. And I guess in this season, why are we seeing so much more of it? I mean, one point is that we could just be picking up issues that have always been present, but maybe because children have been at home, they've not been in school, either those issues have grown in lockdown or parents have become more aware that they're around. And so we're starting to notice and children are being referred. The other thing is, of course, that in this season, there are aspects of it that specifically mean that anxiety is more likely to be present. So things like the change, the uncertainty, the risk, and some of those things going on. So particularly in this moment, what we're looking at is a challenge that isn't of just trying to get rid of anxiety somehow so our children don't experience any ever, because that's not possible. What we've got to be thinking in terms of as parents is, how do we help them learn how to tolerate anxiety and how to respond to it really well? And it's kind of reframing their understanding of anxiety and quite possibly ours as well, therefore, to try and change the way that we respond to it.
I think it's really interesting to say that actually anxiety can be a positive thing, because that's how we're going to cope with something. And it's a recognition that we need to do something further. We're not just carrying on. We need to act on something, or potentially act on something. So what do you think it is about this moment in time that makes it such an issue?
Yeah, I mean, your point you just made is so true. Actually, anxiety in its sort of lower levels actually improves our performance. It helps us concentrate, it helps us focus. It really does work. It makes sure that you concentrate on something that's important. My teenager, she's year 11. She's off doing her GCSEs, or I mean, they're not proper GCSEs, but whatever they are this year. And I want her to be a little bit anxious because I want her to do her best. But what we've got here is a situation for some people where anxiety is going over that state, and it's like a hill. You want to be right at the crest of the hill, and once it starts to tip over, it becomes a problem. It becomes problematic. And in this season, we have got some perfect circumstances that could trigger problematic anxiety. For a significant period of time, we've lived by a rule that says two things really simply, and we've linked them in our minds: stay at home and stay safe. And that means that when we start to go back to normal life, your brain will trigger anxiety. Your children's brains too, because they've heard and absorbed these rules as well. They've seen us stop doing so much and retreat into that safe space. And it doesn't mean that bad things are definitely going to happen. It's your brain's way of telling you that there's risk here, or this is new, this is unusual. And there's so much in your children's world that could be examples of that. So my son has talked several times after his last week at school about the fact his teachers are wearing masks in his school. Some of them are, and that's new. I think there were so many things he was ready for and expected, but that really unsettled him. It took him by surprise. It was clearly something his brain had reacted to and that he needs to process. And anxiety is his brain's way of bringing it to the surface so he can have the conversation with me that helps him to process it. And I guess that's something else that we've got to be aware of in this moment is there are obvious things, that our children might be afraid of going to a space, catching the virus, more obvious things. But pandemic life has also challenged some of the more significant sort of foundations that we build life on. Our safety, our security, our relationships, things like that. And so we might see anxiety being raised as part of some wider questions, which actually would be learnings and ponderings that our kids would be having anyway, depending on their different developmental stages.
So how do we begin to recognize when anxiety is anxiety is a good thing in moderation? How do we recognize when it's becoming something that is going past that good, and we need to start acting on the fact that there is anxiety and it's ongoing and it's an ongoing issue?
Yeah, let's talk about three ways that anxiety starts to become problematic, or 3 things to look for. And the first is when it's gone beyond that sort of going up to the top of the hill and it's started to drop off the end, and it's become overwhelming. It's starting to really influence or limit what children do. There are things that they want to do or they used to do that they're not doing anymore. And part of the reason that's so significant is because one of the most common challenges with anxiety is our instinctive reaction to it, that we tend to avoid the thing that we're anxious of, because in the short term that does drop our anxiety right down. And that's a good approach if the thing we're anxious or scared of is an unusual thing or a really extreme risk, like an angry bear attacking us or a poisonous snake or something like that. But if this is a scenario that we actually face regularly, or something that we do need to be able to cope with, like sitting an exam, going to school, social scenarios, things like that, that's much more of a problem. Or sometimes we become anxious because of one bad experience, something's happened that was traumatic. And what happens then is we avoid that same circumstance again. And so we never learn that that was actually a one-off, that if we'd done that thing again, the bad thing wouldn't have happened, because we were just really unlucky that one time. And then every time we avoid it, what you're doing in your mind is you're strengthening a sort of rule or an understanding that says the only reason the bad thing didn't happen is because I avoided that situation. Okay. And every time you avoid it, you strengthen that belief. And of course, what that means is that over time, what you start to believe is if I ever don't avoid it, that's going to be an absolute disaster. The bad thing will almost definitely happen. So avoidance actually grows anxiety over the long term, and it can grow very, very quickly. Anxiety can be like a forest fire. It can suddenly flare up incredibly quickly, and particularly in children who do react very instinctively and obviously don't have that adult understanding of emotions. They can find themselves suddenly very limited by their fears. So it's important that if we see it starting to have an influence on them and becoming overwhelming, we act quickly. The second time that it's important that we recognize anxiety and that it can cause problems is if it's not identified then. And that can be if children's behavior is misunderstood. You know, sometimes children respond to anxiety in really obvious ways, and they are verbal enough, articulate enough, and old enough to talk about feeling anxious or talk about it in ways that helps us as parents realize that's what's going on. But in younger children and in children who sometimes just don't have that ability, or who are just overwhelmed by what they're feeling, what we see instead is just the outcome of that raised stress and tension. And I think particularly in this season, I'm hearing a lot about that from parents. So what we're seeing is, gosh, it's exactly what we don't really want as parents to be honest. Irritability, argumentative behavior, misbehaving, even tantrums, what we might call attention-seeking behavior. And our children also might not understand why they're reacting the way they are. They know they're being naughty. So then you see that they get upset, and it all just becomes very messy. So we sometimes need to help our kids by recognizing what's going on. You know, my own son last week at times was a bit of a nightmare, and it was my job as his mum to sit down and say, like, mate, how has today been? Is there anything that's made you feel a bit funny? Does your tummy feel a bit sort of squirmy? And then we were able to have the conversations, because there were some things going on that he'd found unexpected. And number 3 then really is about exactly that, because anxiety is much more likely to be a problem when it generates fear. You know, it's not a pleasant feeling. It can trigger some unexpected or difficult behavior. Young children in particular can feel overwhelmed by it. They don't understand why they're acting or reacting the way that they do. So our job as parents is to try to hold it as calmly as we can, and to help them to grow a framework and concept and understanding of not just anxiety, but all their emotions really, and to learn how do you manage it, because this is something that will happen. So what do you do when you feel anxious? We model it ourselves, but also we directly teach them and we talk to them about it. And I think, again, it's a bit like we were talking about last week. One of the difficulties in this moment and in general as parents is that we get quite anxious ourselves. There's so much in the media about mental health. When anxiety is mentioned, it does tend to be as a problem, as an illness. And So I too, you know, I'm a psychologist, but I'm also a mum. And when my kids have started to talk about feeling anxious, there's a little bit of me that thinks, oh my goodness, is this it? Are we going into months and years of therapy? But so far, so good. So I think we all have to be aware of the risk that we are going to have a fear response and try to hold it more calmly. Again, the key to holding your kids' emotions well is actually very often about how we manage our own.
Yeah. And I mean, when you, number one, when you were talking about anxiety as the positive aspect, that's what builds resilience. Because if they avoid something, then they're not building their resilience either. And as long as it's in that safe environment. So if a parent is concerned their child is beginning to show anxiety, they're unsure whether it's beginning to get worse, what is the best thing for them to do? What's your advice for the parent?
Yeah. Okay. So number one, try not to panic yourself. And I know that's easier said than done. And particularly if it's flared up really quickly, sometimes what your kids are doing can look like, oh my goodness, this is really extreme. And I know it's hard. As I say, I'm a psychologist and I'm a mum. And I've had moments where I've had to really take a step back, take a deep breath, just calm down and remember this is probably much more okay than it feels. So don't be too hard on yourself if that is difficult. And actually, it may be in some circumstances that you're not the best person to support your child, to have the conversation, to deal with the situation. It may be that this is a great moment to draw on a grandparent or a godparent or, you know, a good friend, someone who's just a little bit less involved. As parents, we are so emotionally involved. We know it and our kids know it. So sometimes they don't want to talk to us because they don't want to upset us. And sometimes we struggle to stay calm enough to have the conversations well with them. It happens to us all. So if that's you, don't feel bad about it, but do identify it and think about who's in the best position. And I think what we've got to do is think about who and how and where can we create the space where we can have those conversations with our children. So as parents, the best thing that you can do is to already have those spaces in place, to think about when would my child talk to me if they needed to talk about something else. And most of the times you'll probably talk about absolute nonsense in those times. You know, you'll be talking about the latest Roblox game or the latest thing they're watching on Netflix or whatever it is. But sometimes they might need to talk to you. So I, with my elder daughter, we go for weekly coffees with my son. We have these, I still read to him. He's 8. He does not need me to still read stories at bedtime, but he loves it. And what it creates is that space where we're together. And if he needs to, he can talk. And that's my number 2 tip then, is do talk about it. You know, parents, when I speak to parents about anxiety, they're often afraid that if they discuss their kids' fears, it might make them focus on it more, it might grow it. But actually the opposite is true. If you dismiss your fears, very often our instinct is to be like, oh, no, don't worry about that. Come on, let's just get on with it, you know. But that sort of dismissing of our kids' fears actually can make them more afraid. They sort of think, well, if mum or dad or granny or whoever won't even talk about it, this must be really bad. And remember, the purpose of anxiety is to get their brains to deal with a question, with something they've not understood, something that could be important. So if we can create a space where they can talk and process, we'll help them to deal with and ultimately dismiss that anxiety, instead of it sort of getting stuck in this never-ending cycle where it keeps bubbling up to the top. And so we can have conversations about what they're afraid of, try to work it out, because sometimes it's not obvious. Sometimes they might not even know. Sometimes we can also help them understand the thing they're afraid of more, and that will help that processing. I remember my son, he's always been more prone. You know, some people are more anxious in their personalities than others, and he's always been more prone. He developed, when he was probably about 4, this absolute terror of any buzzing insect, because he was clear. My daughter actually has an allergy to bee stings, and I think he'd seen the drama around her getting stung, and he was absolutely terrified of them. So we talked. It got to the point where he wouldn't go outside one day. So I thought, we're going to have to do something about this. So we sat down and we talked about it. And then we planned some really deliberate moments, or I planned, where we'd be able to talk more. And we researched it. We had all sorts of fun finding out about bees and wasps and and what they do, and like what's the point of them, and just learning about them. We learned about how some insects disguise themselves as bees so animals and birds don't eat them. We learned, and we talked, and we chatted, and in all those moments his little mind was processing this sort of threatening thing that he'd suddenly become aware of about the world. And through that process his fear and his anxiety started to diminish. I mean, he still doesn't love buzzing insects now, but at least he will leave the house. He doesn't totally freak out. So think about how you can have those conversations. And remember, you can sometimes break up big challenges, particularly in this season, if it's going back to new things. Let's say your child's got to go back to football or a dance class or something, and they're anxious of it. Break it up, that big challenge, into smaller steps. Maybe go to the field where they used to play football every week, and take your own ball and have a kick around sometime when the whole team's not there, or just walk through the field, or get the football kit out, or do some kicking about in the back garden. And you know, some of the things that will be part of that challenge you can practice beforehand, and it helps your kids and their minds start to work through what they've got to do. And then finally, because you know 3 is always a good number in all of these conversations, so just my third tip would be, don't be afraid to ask for help. You know, with mental and emotional health stuff, too often what we do is we wait and we just say, is it a huge problem? No, it's not. Well, then I don't need to do anything about it. But you would never do that if your child was, you know, just a little bit ill.
No.
You would wait till they were really critically ill before you did anything. So with emotional and mental health stuff, if you know there's something going on and you're a bit worried, your GP will be really happy to have a conversation about it. I know how we get in touch with GPs at the moment is different, but they are there. They're on the end of the phone to chat. They can also refer you to other spaces where you can get extra advice and extra help. So if you're concerned, really do that. And I guess I would say, particularly because of the context we're talking in, if this relates to school and particularly school attendance, now that they're going back after lockdown, if your child's struggling or they're becoming anxious or becoming upset, remember that thing about avoidance can grow anxiety. And it's so tempting. As I've worked with many of my friends and professionally with many children who are struggling with attending school, and it's so tempting if your child is distressed just to say, oh, don't worry, just have today off, it's all right. But in the long run, that's going to make things harder. And it's tempting to think, well, I mustn't tell school because I'll get into trouble. But actually, I would say get straight in touch with school, talk it out. Your child will not be the first one that they've encountered who's experiencing this. And Rian, I guess you might have some specific pointers that you want to say on that too.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, you know, that leads really well into the hub. And I do find, you know, having 4 children myself, you know, they're coming out of teens now, but being emotionally attached to children is far more difficult to solve their issues, or some of their issues, than when you're separate and detached from them. So that's why I think the hub is such a good space, because they can come and say what their worries are, and I can look at them from a detached view and look at them as they are, and then get in touch with parents if I'm concerned, but I'm not emotionally involved. And that does make a huge difference. And I think it does for the children as well. They know that they can come and they can say things, and they know that if I'm concerned, I will contact mum or dad, and I will say, you know, are you okay if I drop mum or dad an email? And if I'm not, then, you know, I always make a log of our conversations, and then I'll know if a child keeps coming back over the same issue. One thing I did hear, which I thought was quite good advice, was if you're talking, especially to older children, talking in the car is a really good way, because then they're sitting at the side of you, and it's not the eye contact, especially when they're becoming, you know, coming up to their teens, isn't great. So
that's so true. I think we said last week, didn't we, as adults, sometimes we like to talk to our kids like, right, we need to talk, let's sit opposite each other and have an intense conversation. But for teenagers, because of the way their minds are changing, they feel exposed already. And definitely on a long walk, or if you're lucky enough to have to drive anywhere, if you get to leave the house, then in the car, in the dark is another really good thing, you know, or in their room, but sit like next to them so that you're alongside.
You're avoiding the eye contact. And then I suppose it's not confrontational as well. They may say it's confrontational, you know, tell me your problems, and they, you know, they may not want to tell it in that way. I mean, I think that the parents, most of the parents know me. They all know about I would hope they all know about the hub. And I have a good rapport with the children and with the parents. So I think the hub especially is a really good asset for the school. I think it works really well. What I'd like to do for the next session is to invite the parents to have questions. I haven't had any questions come in, but hopefully after this session there might be some questions. If not, then we'll just do another general chat before Easter.
There are so many things that we know are becoming more problematic in this season, but also just as a parent, I know there are things that are challenging, and there's a lot that we could chat about, sleep, eating patterns, or behavioral challenges, aggression, or the changes in the brain as kids hit, and the joys of adolescence. We're doing that with my 8-year-old at the moment. So if you have questions, do send them in, do share them.
That would be great. Okay, Kate, thank you so much for the second session. And we'll catch up next week for our third session.
Great. See you then.
All right. Thanks.